There's probably someone in your life right now that you can't stand. Not a villain, not someone who did something dramatic, just a person. And there's a specific thing about them, the way they carry themselves, something they say, the way they operate, that gets under your skin in a way you can't quite explain. You've described it to other people. You've replayed it on the drive home. You've constructed entire imaginary conversations where you finally say the thing you should have said. And you've probably told yourself it's because they're difficult, because they're exactly the kind of person who rubs people wrong, because other people see it too. Here's the thing. Almost everything you've been told about why certain people bother you is backwards. There's a pattern that shows up across psychology research, cross-cultural and replicated, that most people never hear about. The traits that bother you most intensely, the specific qualities you find genuinely difficult to be around, those traits correlate statistically with qualities you already carry but haven't acknowledged. The more strongly you react, the more pointed the signal. Psychologist Loretta Breuning noted that anger at others frequently functions as a cover for discomfort with ourselves. Researchers studying projection mechanisms found that people with higher self-awareness, people who could acknowledge their own flaws, showed measurably less of this kind of displacement onto others. Your reaction to that person isn't a verdict about them. It's information about you. I've described certain people with the same 3 words so many times I stopped noticing I always reached for the same 3 words. It took a while before I asked why those particular words came so easily. If that's true, if that person is actually a mirror, then what exactly is the mirror showing you? 2,000 years ago, Marcus Aurelius, the man who ran the Roman Empire, wrote something every single morning before his day started. And the most important part of what he wrote is almost always cut out of the version people share online. But before we get to the mirror, you need to understand what your brain is actually doing when that person walks into the room. The label you just put on that person, lazy, arrogant, fake, you didn't pick it randomly. Your brain doesn't just notice what other people do. It classifies them, constantly, automatically, and with very specific language. And the vocabulary you reach for when you're describing someone who bothers you isn't pulled from some neutral dictionary. It comes from somewhere closer than that. In 1977, a psychologist named Lee Ross at Stanford identified what he called the fundamental attribution error. It's one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. When someone else does something wrong or frustrating, we almost automatically assign it to their character, not their circumstances. She's just lazy. He's just arrogant. That's who they are. We don't extend the same interpretation to ourselves. When we do the same thing, we have context, we have reasons, but them, no. That's just who they are. That's been in the textbooks for decades. But there's a detail that almost never gets mentioned in the follow-up research. The trait label you choose isn't random. The specific word you reach for, lazy, arrogant, dishonest, needy, tends to be the exact word you've been using internally to describe a part of yourself you're not comfortable with, not consciously, not deliberately. But the vocabulary of projection is precise. You don't randomly land on arrogant. You land on it because you already know what it feels like from the inside. Think about it this way. Someone who gets reliably irritated by other people's arrogance is often sitting on a pile of unacknowledged ambition. Someone who can't stand fake people is frequently suppressing a version of themselves that performs for certain rooms. The word you reach for is a map. You drew it yourself. You just forgot you drew it. I spent years describing one particular person as someone who needed to be the smartest person in the room. Then I noticed I'd written that sentence about 4 different people, different contexts, different relationships, different decades. And it took even longer to figure out what that said about the room I was carrying around in my own head. So the brain is already doing something strange here. But here's where the standard advice makes it worse. The advice you've been given about difficult people is pretty consistent. Set a boundary. Limit your exposure. Or if you're feeling bold, confront them. Have the conversation. Clear the air. These are presented as the mature responses. The functional adult moves. And they might be, depending on the situation, but every single one of them treats the other person as the problem, which is exactly why they don't fix anything. Think about what limit your exposure actually does. You see that person less. The feeling doesn't go anywhere. It waits. And if you've ever successfully avoided someone who bothered you, you probably notice something strange a few months later. A new person, different context, no connection to the first one at all, producing the exact same feeling in you. Same irritation, same specific quality, different face. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern with a return address. Here's the mechanism behind it. In 2003, James Gross and Oliver John at Stanford published a study tracking 1,483 people and their emotional regulation habits. What they found was this: people who habitually suppress uncomfortable emotions, who push things down instead of looking at them, showed significantly lower well-being, worse social functioning, and reduced life satisfaction over time. But the more specific finding is the one that matters here. The traits you suppress don't disappear. They get externalized. They show up in how you see other people. The more consistently you refuse to acknowledge a quality in yourself, the more intensely you'll react to it when you spot it somewhere else. You're not irritated by every lazy person you've ever met, just certain ones. You're not bothered by every arrogant person in existence. Just specific ones in specific moments with a specific intensity that doesn't quite match the situation. That selectivity is information. Your nervous system is pointing at something. It's just pointing inward, and you've been looking outward. Avoiding the person doesn't dissolve the projection. Confronting them doesn't either. You're arguing with a mirror. They could change completely, apologize, improve, disappear from your life entirely. And the feeling would find somewhere else to live, because it was never really about them. I tried the limit exposure approach for about 2 years with one particular person, found a replacement within 3 months. Different person, no overlap in any other area of my life, producing the exact same feeling. That's not bad luck. And here's the part that makes this more than an interesting theory. A man figured this out while being actively tortured, and wrote it down. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man alive when he wrote this. He commanded the largest military force on earth. He controlled more territory than any single person before or since, and he still needed to write it every morning. Not for anyone else. The Meditations wasn't published, wasn't shared. It wasn't a philosophical treatise meant for posterity. It was a private notebook, written in Greek, not Latin, because Greek was the language he used to think, not the language he used to govern. He deliberately kept those two things separate. The man who issued orders to legions in Latin sat alone and argued with himself in Greek. Book 2, Chapter 1. Written while he was on military campaign near the Danube River around 170 AD. Here's how it starts. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. Most people stop there. That's the version that gets shared. It sounds like a coping strategy. A way of lowering your expectations before the day starts. Brace for the difficult people. Pre-accept that they'll be difficult. But that's not what he wrote. He kept going. And the next part is the part almost nobody quotes. He wrote, "They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind." Read that again slowly. Not, I forgive them. Not, I understand their circumstances. Not, I choose to rise above it. Something much more specific and much more uncomfortable than any of that. He's saying, the person who frustrates me shares my nature, not their situation, not their upbringing, their mind, the same raw material, the same capacity for every quality he'd just listed. He wasn't writing that to feel better about difficult people. He was writing it as a diagnosis. My reaction to these people will tell me something about myself, not about them. This was a man running an empire, managing generals, negotiating with foreign powers, dealing with corruption inside his own court. And every single morning he sat down and reminded himself that the people who frustrated him were mirrors, not obstacles. He didn't do this because it was comfortable. He did it because he understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. 2,000 years later, researchers at Stanford ran the numbers. Carl Jung called it the shadow, not a metaphor, a clinical term. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is the storage unit for everything you've decided you're not. Every trait you rejected, suppressed, or quietly agreed to never be. It doesn't leave. It goes underground. And it accumulates. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it shows up in your conscious life, the denser it gets. The more pressure behind it. The more intensely it needs somewhere to go. And where it goes, consistently, is onto other people. This is what projection actually is, not a vague psychological concept, but a specific pressure valve. The traits you've locked away need expression. They can't get it from you directly. So they come out sideways, as recognition, as irritation, as that very specific, slightly disproportionate feeling you get around one particular person who is somehow, inexplicably, always doing the thing that bothers you most. Now here's where it stops being theory. Gross and John at Stanford didn't study the shadow. They didn't use Jungian language. They ran a controlled study on 1,483 people, measuring what happens when you habitually suppress uncomfortable emotions. And what they found maps exactly onto what Jung described. People who suppress show measurably worse outcomes across relationships and well-being. But the specific mechanism is this: suppression doesn't neutralize the emotion, it redirects it. The thing you won't look at in yourself shows up as the thing you can't stop noticing in others. Marcus Aurelius didn't have Jung's vocabulary. He didn't have Stanford's methodology. What he had was a notebook and enough self-awareness to notice that his reactions to other people were telling him something about himself. So he wrote it down every morning. Same mind, same nature. Look at the reaction, not at them. 2,000 years of independent lines, Stoic philosophy, Jungian psychology, Stanford research, all landing on the same point. You've been carrying that person around, not in reality, in your head. The version you replay on the drive home, the imaginary argument at 11 at night, the sentence you've rehearsed but never said. That's not them. That version, that feeling, that specific texture of irritation, it's a part of you that hasn't been looked at yet, and it found the most efficient way it could to get your attention. Seneca figured this out too. Every night, after the light was out and his wife had gone quiet, he reviewed his entire day. His exact words: I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. He wrote that in On Anger, around 60 AD. No therapist, no framework. Just a man alone in the dark, asking himself hard questions about his own reactions before he let himself sleep. That's shadow work, written down 1900 years before the term existed. There's a person I used to describe as exhausting to be around. Stopped seeing them a few years ago. The quality showed up in someone else about 6 months later. Same word, different face. I've stopped being surprised by that now. I've started being curious about it instead. So if the problem isn't them, what do you actually do with this? This is where most videos give you a list, 5 steps, 3 habits, a morning routine you'll follow for exactly 4 days before your actual life resumes. This isn't that. What you've been doing, carrying that person around, replaying the version of them that bothers you, constructing the imaginary conversation, that's already a daily practice. You're already putting time into this. You just haven't been directing it anywhere useful. Here's what the research actually points at. In 1986, a psychologist named James Pennebaker at the University of Texas ran a simple experiment. He asked people to write for 15 minutes a day, 4 days in a row, about their deepest thoughts and feelings around something emotionally difficult. No editing, no grammar, just continuous writing, straight through. The control group wrote about neutral topics. What happened over the following 6 months? The people who wrote about the difficult material visited the student health center at roughly half the rate of the control group. Not mood surveys, actual medical visits. The effect showed up in the body. That study has now been replicated across more than 200 controlled experiments. The outcomes extend beyond mood. Immune function, blood pressure, anxiety symptoms, relationship quality. 15 minutes, 4 days. But here's the specific application that matters for this. You're not writing about that person. You're writing about your reaction to them. The question isn't, why do they bother me? The question is, what part of me recognizes this? What is it in me that knows exactly what to call this quality, that spots it immediately, that keeps a running inventory of every time they do it? Write toward that, not toward them. Most people who do this don't become indifferent to the difficult people in their lives. The person doesn't suddenly seem fine. What changes is simpler than that. You stop carrying them home. The feeling stops having the same gravitational pull, because you've looked at what it was actually attached to. Seneca reviewed his day every night before sleep. Marcus wrote his mirror exercise every morning before the day started. Neither of them was trying to become a better person in some abstract sense. They were just trying to stop being surprised by their own reactions, to see the thing clearly before it ran them. You can keep treating the person as the problem. Some of them probably are difficult. Some of them probably do need less of your time. That's real and it's legitimate. But the specific quality that follows you from person to person, the one that shows up reliably in different faces across different years, that one isn't about them. If you want a place to start, 4 days, 15 minutes, one question. What part of me already knew what to call this? What is the mirror showing you? Exactly the part of you that you've refused to look at long enough that it needed to show up in someone else. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it's a more honest place to start than the imaginary conversation you've already been having. If this landed somewhere specific, the next video is probably the one about why you can't stop thinking about what they said. Same mirror, different angle.